Thanks. I was waiting for a hi sign, and we don't even need one. Oh, it's not like all that. Usually, you wait for the guy in the headset to give you like that, and you know, we're a little bit less formal today. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here to this presentation from America Abroad. It's the show that brings global issues home to Americans. I'm Todd Zwillich, host of The Takeaway from Public Radio International and WNYC. And it's a pleasure to be invited to host this panel today. And I've been excited about it as I've been preparing, because the issue of North Korea is rising to the forefront of Americans' minds. These are experts here with me, and you're all well-versed in this topic too. And many Americans, for the first time in a long time, are starting to think a lot harder about North Korea, about the potential threat, and about what it means for them. And everybody in Washington's thinking about it as well. So I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad to be part of this. I'm joined by four panelists who bring a wide range of perspectives on North Korea. First is our host, Frank Aum, who's the U.S. Institute of Peace's expert focusing on Korean Peninsula issues from 2001 until this year. Frank served as the senior advisor for North Korea in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome.
Thank you.
That's it. He is your host after all. Jean Lee is here. Jean was the first American granted access to North Korea, and in 2012 she became the chief of the Associated Press's Pyongyang bureau. Currently she's a global fellow at the Wilson Center. And an AP reporter, which makes you my colleague in the press, so that's a pleasure as well. Former AP reporter. Anthony Ruggiero is on the end. Anthony is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies. He's a former government expert on targeted financial measures, sanctions against hostile regimes. He was part of the six-party talks on denuclearization and a non-proliferation advisor for the United States, and he's here to guide us through some of the questions of sanctions as we move forward. So it's good to have you, Anthony. He deserves a hand. You all know Glyn Ford, who is furthest to my right. He was a member of the European Parliament for 25 years, focusing on Asia-related issues. He's also co-authored a book, North Korea on the Brink, Struggle for Survival. Glyn, it's good to have you as well.
Thank you.
So before we start our discussion, let's start with the news. It's a good place to start. The latest ballistic missile launch from the North Koreans. Now, North Korea claims that this latest missile flew to an altitude 10 times the height of the International Space Station. That might not mean much, but what you need to know is that it went so very high that it can go so very far. And apparently now that missile could land on Chicago, or maybe Cleveland, or maybe even my hometown of Hershey, Pennsylvania, if Kim decided that was a place he wanted to hit. Let's hear from UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. I think we have audio.
We have never sought war with North Korea, and still today, we do not seek it. If war does come, it will be because of continued acts of aggression like we witnessed yesterday. And if war comes, make no mistake, the North Korean regime will be utterly destroyed.
Rhetoric from Nikki Haley, the United States ambassador to the United Nations. Frank, let me start with you since you're our host. This latest test, the latest in a long series of ballistic missile tests that we've all watched, does it change the state of play in a fundamental way? The fact that this missile now, we're all aware, can not only reach the West Coast, but the continental United States. Is this just a continuation of a new positioning from North Korea, or do you see something fundamentally different here?
Well, thank you, Todd. So you're right. The test that North Korea conducted earlier this week is the latest version of their ballistic missile. It was the Hwasong-15. It was a very large missile, had advanced second stage capability, and it can pretty much, the effective range was 8,000 miles, so that can cover all the United States. Now, I wouldn't call it necessarily a fundamental shift in a technical capability sense. We knew that this test was coming. They've conducted similar tests before in July, 2 ICBM tests. If there's a fundamental shift, I would say it could potentially be more in their political posture, because Kim Jong-un has said before that he wants to simultaneously develop the nuclear weapons program as well as the economy. And now with this test, he stated that North Korea has finalized the nuclear weapons force. So we may be looking for a shift in North Korea's regime towards more of economic development. We may even see a pivot to an opening and engagement.
One bit of speculation or analysis that I've heard is this dual track, right? Developing weapons, developing the economy, suggesting that Kim is looking for space now that he's proven he has this capability. Back off, leave me alone, let me restructure my economy without interference from the Americans or from the South Koreans, indeed. Do you buy that sort of strategic take?
That's what he said since he's implemented that. It's called the Pyongyang line, the dual track development of the nuclear weapons and economy. He said that, I think, at least since 2013. We'll see. It remains to be seen in the upcoming months whether that policy will move forward now that he's secured his nuclear weapons.
One of the features of this show is input from people around the world and from listeners and viewers. So I want to play, I think this is a video clip now. This is coming from Ji-Hyun Hwang, who's a student at Hankook Academy of Foreign Relations in South Korea. Let's play this clip. This is probably in Korean, so for the benefit of some of you, I'm going to translate after a minute here.
네, 일단은 저는 트럼프 대통령이 가지고 있는 그러한
It says, I want to learn more about the specific ideologies that President Trump might have. Since the nuclear issue is a problem for the entire world, we must understand each country's policy. And then she asks if she has a message for President Trump, and her response is, please study the history. Using Twitter does not mean you are communicating with the people. Who wants to talk about Twitter? Anyone want to talk about Glyn, I'm going to go to you. We'll talk about more of the substance, but I want you to talk about Twitter for a moment because this is a very new way of communicating on the world stage. Do you have a sense of how the North interprets Twitter messages from the president, whether insulting or bombastic? Do they ignore them? Is it just part of the background, or is it important?
No, they certainly talk about them. I was in Pyongyang last week talking to people in the Korean Workers' Party, and they talk about Trump's Twitter feed. But of course, being British, I'm also aware of some of his more recent endeavors on Twitter. So after that, one really wonders, having retweeted some of the most vile and material from the extreme neo-Nazi right in Britain, which is actually false videos, seems to be, it wouldn't encourage the North Koreans very much. I mean, his recent contribution this morning on Twitter with respect to North Korea was less than fully helpful in the sense that one's got to understand that for the North Koreans, like it or not, I mean, Kim Jong-un is almost a god. And if you're insulting him, it makes it very difficult to come to the table. They're quite willing to put up with, if you want, insults or threats of being wiped out. I mean, that's fine. They understand that. But actually going to the extent of, if you want, lèse-majesté, is a step too far. I mean, just imagine what would happen in Japan if you insulted the emperor. Or we know what happens in Thailand. If you insult the king, you get 20 years in jail.
Who's reading Twitter in North Korea? Is it just a small handful of elites?
Oh yeah. I mean, the people who matter at the top, they get a daily, they get an equivalent of reference news, which is a daily compilation of world news, which clearly, even if they're not seeing Twitter itself, it's being covered. I mean, part of the problem is that they have all the information, but they don't understand what it means necessarily. I mean, they can talk about local election results in France or whatever, but not necessarily capable of understanding. And one of the problems they have with the United States, it's a very different system from their own, and they don't understand checks and balances, and they don't understand that people in the same administration are actually saying different things at the same time.
Jean-Lee, let me go to you and talk a little bit more deeply about American strategy. It's clear, or it seems clear, that the Trump administration has abandoned strategic patience, the doctrine of the Obama administration before it. Or have they? I mean, they've gone to great lengths to rhetorically abandon strategic patience. But have you noticed a substantive difference, a substantive shift in strategy or even tactics, aside from the Twitter feed, from this administration than from the one or the two before it?
Well, let's talk about that Twitter feed. I will answer that question.
Go right ahead.
Because one of the differences we're seeing in terms of Obama-era policy and strategic patience versus the Trump Twitter feed is the rhetoric. And the rhetoric coming from the Twitter feed is not only confusing to the North Koreans, also confusing to the South Koreans because it doesn't jive with the policy that his Secretary of State is putting out there when it comes to dealing with North Korea. The rhetoric, part of the strategy of strategic patience was, it's kind of like when you have a naughty child. There's a theory that perhaps you shouldn't give that child the attention that child is craving, right? Put it in the naughty corner. But part of that policy was to kind of ignore the provocations and not to kind of feed it. But what we're getting with these really crazy tweets from the president's feed is a rise in this war of words between North Korea and the United States. And certainly what I think people in South Korea are worried about is if both of these leaders raise the rhetoric to the point where they can't back down, is that going to lead the region into some sort of a conflict? So it's very confusing for people in South Korea, I have to say, not to mention those of us here in the US and the North Koreans. I have to remind you that we have a state of an armistice and a ceasefire in place on the Korean Peninsula. So militarily, we're limited to a certain degree if we abide by that armistice. North Korea knows that and is really trying to push things just up to the limit. But Donald Trump, the president, can threaten all he wants in his rhetoric, but there is a limit to a certain degree, if you're going to follow the code of conduct, to what you can do in terms of military action. Of course, they can go ahead and do it, but there is an armistice or a ceasefire that has been in place since 1953, so it's something to keep in mind.
We're going to talk a little bit more about military options, such as they are, a little bit later in the program. Anthony Ruggiero, sticking on the Twitter theme for one moment, another feature of the president's Twitter feed when it comes to the North is pushing the Chinese and sometimes encouraging them, sometimes praising them, sometimes insulting them as well, trying to get them to ratchet up and crack down on their client state, North Korea, somewhat of a client. Is that effective, not just on Twitter, but maybe using real diplomacy? How far has the Trump administration gotten with their calls to the Chinese government to get tough on North Korea from their end?
Right. You know, when you ask the question about comparing the Trump administration policy and the Obama administration policy of strategic patience, you know, the relationship with China, I think, is the biggest example of the difference. I mean, this is the first administration that has really gone after China with sanctions for their facilitation of North Korea's sanctions evasion. You know, there are many times they've gone after one Chinese bank. They've gone after numerous Chinese nationals. I think, you know, the interesting part, you know, to your point about public talking about how Xi and Trump have a close relationship, but it's clear in private that there's a tough message being delivered, because for the Trump's trip to Beijing, he was very public in his praise for President Xi, and then only a few weeks later he comes back and there are, you know, strong sanctions against Chinese entities. I would also come back, if I can come back for a second, back to the question of, you know, does this missile test mean now we're moving forward on diplomacy, or is this a sign? You know, I have to caution, first of all, that we saw larger missile systems in the April parade. So this is not the end of North Korea's missile program. It's not the end of North Korea's dangerous missile program. There are probably larger missiles that they're working on now. And I remember, it was only Monday, the day before the test, where people were saying that this 70-day pause in testing was an opportunity for negotiations. And that's not true. What we now learned is that North Korea was using that 70-day window to build a lot bigger missile to reach the United States. So I think we have to be very careful about suggesting that the North Koreans are going to all of a sudden throw up their hands and say, okay, now let's have a negotiation. They're only going to want it on their terms, and it's not going to be on denuclearization terms.
But what's changed is that, at least after this missile test, the North Koreans, or Kim Jong-un, has actually said they're at the end of their program. I mean, in a sense, if they retest in the near future, that's a loss of faith for him. He said it's complete. So it seems to me that we're in a much better position than we've been in the past. I mean, I have to say, Barack Obama described his policy as strategic patience, and I term it malign neglect. I mean, the sanctions were on and they were squeezing North Korea. So it wasn't a benign operation by any means. But I think the key thing to realize is that the administration completely misunderstands China's influence. Because, frankly, on the economy, China has some ability to hurt North Korea, but of course it doesn't want to collapse the state. The last thing it wants is US troops on the southern bank of the Yellow River. Political terms...
Or North Korean refugees pouring into China, for that matter.
I'm pouring into South Korea. I mean, there'll be 10 million in South Korea and 2 million in China. So, I mean, the people who've got the big problem are in the south. But the point being that China's got almost no political influence over North Korea. I mean, they refused the foreign minister who wanted to come about 6 weeks ago. So this notion that some people still have, that sort of the North Korean Workers' Party is some kind of subsidiary of the Beijing, the Chinese Communist Party, is complete nonsense. And the sooner people learn that, the better, because at the moment he's pushing on a lever with no fulcrum.
All right, I do want to stick on China for the next part of our discussion, but Jean, you wanted to add something about missiles.
I just wanted to mention that I read the statement about completion of the testing or the program a little bit differently. I read them as saying that we've begun the final process of completing this, this nuclear weaponry, which I read to mean that actually they acknowledge that they have a couple more tests they may need to conduct. So I think we can't relax quite yet. And I think that experts might agree that they have to master re-entry. So there are a couple different components before they actually have a weapon system that can truly threaten us. That said, I think every single test is very dangerous for other reasons. But I think that we should keep in mind, too, that it might be some political posturing. Kim Jong-un did say on January 1st, on New Year's Day, he said, I'm going to complete this by the end of the year. So he had to show his people that he had this timeline and he was going to complete it. And also, I just want to point out, I had expected a test. I know everybody was saying, what is up with this 75-day lull? But I had been expecting one in December, because the times that I've been in North Korea in December, under Kim Jong-un, this has been a time for testing, because December is the month that his father, Kim Jong-il, passed away. So there are a couple different domestic reasons for why Kim Jong-un wanted to test this missile.
What better way to honor your relatives? Yeah. Frank, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, so China doesn't have as much political influence on North Korea as people say, but they do have the leverage. And so it's just basically a reiteration of Anthony's point that China has increased the enforcement of the sanctions, and we're seeing that a lot over the last 6 to 8 months. Now,
that's good, because I do want to stay with China, because we have another contributor from China. This is Yita Wang, an office worker in Shanghai. She has this message for President Trump. Let's watch the clip, and I'm going to use my abilities for translation yet again.
向我们的习主席学习吧，一带一路。
He says, learn from our President Xi. Things like One Belt, One Road, the Silk Road, peaceful development, shared prosperity. Being the only powerful country isn't fun. Look at China and Russia. We're on great terms. Why do you have to do what you've been doing? Everyone should participate. You should not dominate the game all by yourself. I think that most Chinese people share this view. Anthony, President Trump may agree with Yitao Yang here. Here, the U.S. has been trying to deal China further into this process, right, than probably many officials in China want. China is split on how far to go in pushing on the North Koreans. Isn't that right, when you look at the Chinese options for sanctions?
Well, the Chinese leadership faces a difficult decision. The North Koreans, they learned in 2005 when the United States sanctioned Banco Delta Asia, Bank of Macau, that they should not have all of their operations in one place. And so while they do have a majority of their operations in one country, it's diverse. And the question for the Chinese leadership is, how long are they going to look the other way? And I think that I agree with what the other panelists have said, is that China has very little political leverage, but with the amount of trade that they have with North Korea, it's hard to claim, as the Chinese continue to do, that they have really no leverage with North Korea. It's clear that they have leverage with North Korea. I mean, the issue here is really going to come down to the United States is going to have to use its own sanctions against China to get them to act. And we don't have a lot of examples of it because, as I said, there haven't been a lot of examples of the U.S. sanctioning China. But in some of the cases where the U.S. has acted first, the Chinese have followed that with investigations and looking into the activities. And we're going to have to see more of that. I don't think the Chinese are ready to do that on their own nationals, but we have to get to that point.
I'm going to take this opportunity to own and trademark the phrase domino sanctions. That's what you're talking about, is us leaning on China with sanctions so that China turns around and leans on the North.
Right. I mean, the issue here is that the Chinese are willing to, as I like to say, nibble around the edges a little bit and target North Koreans that are engaged in these activities. And certainly there are North Koreans engaged in these activities. I don't want to suggest there are not, but there are far more Chinese companies and nationals and banks that are engaged in this activity with North Korea. And the question we all have to ask ourselves is, the UN is not going to, Chinese are not going to allow the UN to sanction Chinese persons. So it's really left to the United States. And, just a part of history, since I worked on Iran sanctions as well, is exactly what we did on Iran sanctions. I mean, the United States, a majority of the sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table were not UN sanctions. They were US sanctions that were implemented by the United States and a group of like-minded countries. And that's probably what it's going to come down to with North Korea. And the question is going to be, is China going to be the one that's sanctioned, or are they going to be the one that help implement those sanctions?
Well, sanctions are...
What's the purpose of sanctions? Because they're not stopping North Korea developing nuclear weapons, and there's no prospect that the sanctions that you've got now will actually stop that process happening. So what are they there for?
Well, I mean, I've written extensively on this since I've left the U.S. government. It's pretty clear, if you look at the numbers, just even back to February 2016, looking at U.S. sanctions alone, North Korea was 8th in country sanctions programs. And that was before, it had done numerous nuclear tests and missile tests. It was behind such, large threats to the United States as Zimbabwe and the Balkans, and other countries that certainly were not as much of a threat to the United States as North Korea was at that time.
I mean, I understand the argument for sanctions, but the sanctions were supposed to stop North Korea becoming a nuclear weapons power capable of hitting the United States. Now, it's very clear that the sanctions you have now will not stop that happening. I mean, the CIA assessment says they have the capability of hitting the United States with a nuclear weapon within 3 months. Now, you really think sanctions are going to work in the next 8 weeks?
Well, I mean, that's your opinion. I would say the goal of sanctions is denuclearization of North Korea through negotiations. And I will also use the Iran example again. I remember very clearly that people said that Iran would never return to the negotiating table. They said that you could never go after Iran's oil revenue. That would be a third rail, and other things like that. The North Koreans have not yet felt what it is like to have the United States government use Iran-style sanctions on them. And you know who knows that? The Chinese know that. And so I think the clear issue here is, will the North Korean regime, the elites, the military, and the weapons programs be able to continue to get revenue when Chinese banks are sanctioned and they're not able to process those transactions for them?
All right, so Anthony, you're making the argument, and I'm glad you did, because I was going to ask you about this anyway, that there is a lot of room left to squeeze, that the sanctions are not nearly done if we want to ratchet them down more. We're coming up on a break soon, and this gives me an opportunity, because sanctions are a two-way street. You can be the sanctioner, but the sanctionee is part of this equation as well. And I'd like to get maybe a minute or 90 seconds from each of you, and we can go down the line. Glyn, we can start with you. What you think North Korea wants from this entire confrontation? Do they want out from under sanctions? Do they want room to rebuild the economy? Do they just want to be tough? So start there. What do they want?
Regime survival. And they see two elements to regime survival. Firstly, they need a nuclear deterrent. They're not capable of competing with the United States on conventional weapons. They're outspent by a factor of 50 with the United States, Japan, and South Korea. And then they want to develop the economy. They have to develop the economy so the people that matter, the 2 billion people in Pyongyang, actually see rising standards of living, and preferably the rest of the country as well, but they're the key people. So that's what it's about, regime survival.
You agree, Frank?
I do, and I don't have anything to add on that point, but I do want to reiterate that the U.S. intelligence community assesses that there's no amount of pressure that would get Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapons. Senator Corker admitted as much in a Meet the Press interview a couple months ago. So I think the question is, and advocates of sanctions will say that we now have a tougher set of sanctions right now, but it takes a certain amount of time, 3 years, 4 years, and that may be the case. The question is, do we have the time to wait for the sanctions to kick in?
I would agree. We don't have time. It takes a couple years before sanctions really, truly bite. Of course, a lot of that is enforcement of sanctions, and it'll take some time to make sure that all the countries are enforcing them. I do think, and I can tell you I was in North Korea earlier this year, and the people that I worked with were very concerned about a fuel embargo from China. And so that is one area, and I can guarantee you that the U.S. mission to the United Nations is working on trying to convince their partners on the UN Security Council to agree to that. That will affect the daily lives of North Koreans.
Frank, I have a feeling that you would agree that a fuel embargo would probably go a long way. And a more complete embargo on North Korea, since you're looking for Iran-style sanctions. But what do you think the North wants from this entire confrontation?
Sure. I mean, I think North Korea wants a unified Korean peninsula under the rule of the North Korean regime. I think that's pretty much their long-term goal. I think, just broadly on sanctions, I'm sure we'll discuss this later, but I'd be very interested to hear the other alternatives, because to me, with a country that has violated almost every negotiated settlement that we've had with them, and I'm not advocating for sanctions on its own, that I'm interested in what the other panelists, I'm sure we'll get into it later, see as an alternative to sanctions. Sanctions only take as long as we are willing to implement them. I think the Trump administration has made significant strides over the last 10 months. But I think that the intelligence assessment is interesting, but perhaps we'll see what happens moving forward.
Before we come right up on the break, which is in just a minute, I want to do host prerogative again. Frank, since you're our host, get you to talk about your neighbors a little bit. We're right across the street from the State Department here in Foggy Bottom. There's some Rex Tillerson news happening. Nobody's noticed because there's so much else going on in Washington today. It would appear in Trump administration fashion that the Secretary of State is on the way out. When you look at American diplomacy with the South, with China, with North Korea, such as it is, even though the president said Rex Tillerson was wasting his time trying to talk to the North Koreans, is this shakeup that we're in for disruptive, or does it not matter at all?
Well, it's hard to comment on something that hasn't happened yet, but I would say that, so one of the issues with the current policy is that I think the Trump administration has been very clear about what they're trying to do. They're trying to maximize pressure against North Korea. They want to isolate North Korea. They want to cut it off from the international financial system. That part is very clear. I think what's not clear is, and very muddled, is how they message their openness to engagement. So, for example, President Trump will say that he's willing to meet with Kim Jong-un and have talks, and then later he'll tweet that talks are a waste of time. And I think also in between what President Trump says and what his senior officials say, there hasn't been a lot of consistency. So I think if you have a new Secretary of State, I think the name out there right now is the CIA Director, Mike Pompeo. If he's more aligned with President Trump, at least you'll have some better consistency in the messaging.
In the messaging, if he's more aligned with President Trump, does that mean more actual pressure? Is there anything practical that goes on in the diplomacy end if you get rid of this sort of separation of vision between Tillerson and Trump that we've been told exists? If they become more aligned, what happens?
Well, I think, so the way President Trump articulated the strategy initially back in May after the review was that it was a strategy of maximum pressure and engagement. But I feel like the engagement part sort of fell off and people didn't understand what engagement meant because there didn't seem to be any efforts at engagement. But how I interpret engagement from the administration is that they're engaging diplomatically to put pressure on other countries to enforce sanctions. So that's one definition of engagement.
That's not engagement, that's non-engagement.
I think that's probably one plausible way that they're defining it, and that would be consistent with Trump's message.
All right, we're going to take a short break now so everybody can take a sip of water and we can reset. And when we come back, we're going to talk about whether this whole situation actually has us closer to nuclear war, which is really the question behind all of this, whether it's likely or not. And we're also going to hear from some people who've been through it. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone. It's good to have you with us. Thanks for, you're all getting settled there. Welcome back. It's good to have you all with us. It's been 72 years since the world has seen the destruction caused by nuclear weapons. Most people have no real sense of what a nuclear bomb means, but Terumi Tanaka does have a sense. He was 13 years old and living in Nagasaki when the United States dropped the atomic bomb on his city. He lived about 2 miles from ground zero and somehow survived, even though the bomb devastated his neighborhood. That's just amazing. 2 days later, he and his mother visited the epicenter searching for their family members who live nearby. Here's how he described the scene. This clip is in Japanese, so I'm going to translate this one as well. He says houses were gone. Only the steel bars of concrete buildings stood bare and hollow. Steel bars of factories were entirely bent. Everything else was a burnt field. On the way to my aunt's house, we saw blackened bodies all over the place, probably burned underneath houses that burned down. People who died from severe injuries and burns, they were left on the ground without being collected. Those who were gravely injured and alive were left to writhe in pain without rescue. Today, Mr. Tanaka is a nuclear engineer himself, and he's an activist against nuclear weapons. And as he told us, he feels things are going in the wrong direction. Listen. Well, he says further there, it's especially disconcerting that the current Japanese government is actively feeding the military threat. The United States and Japan claim that North Korea is provoking, but the United States has come all the way over to do military exercise in close proximity to North Korea. So it appears to me, rather, that it's the United States that is provoking more. I want the United States to stop provoking. Instead, work to create the conditions to make dialogue possible. Glyn Ford, I think that a lot of people in Japan might feel differently from Mr. Tanaka there. They've seen North Korean missiles flying over their territory. There have been air raid drills.
Where else could they go?
Where else? Well, let me get the question out, and then I want you to answer.
People in Japan have seen North Korean missile tests flying over their territory, right? They've had air raid sirens going off in exercises. What do you make of what Mr. Tanaka has to say about...
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with Mr. Tanaka. Yeah. I mean, why have they got air raid sirens going off? It's because Abe wants to get rid of Article 9 of the Constitution. And the only way to do that is to frighten the Japanese people, which is why Japan is not interested in a settlement of the North Korean situation, because that means he'd lose his referendum. Even with the North Korean threat, the latest opinion polls put him 6% behind, and he's going to call a referendum. So Japan's interest is to actually make every phone ring every time there's a North Korean missile within 1,000 miles. So, and if you want to launch a medium-range missile, there's no other direction to go.
So you think that the government in Japan has a stake in alarmism here?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the ones that wrecked the six-party talks. I mean, I understand. I have a great deal of sympathy with the issue of the abductees. But because of the abductee issue, they refused to agree anything, which is why the North Koreans walked away, and why the North Koreans have refused consistently to go back to the six-party talks, because they weren't a venue that was going to get anywhere.
Frank, is the experience in Japan with American nuclear weapons is part of their culture now, obviously. Does that experience and the nightmare of it feed into the modern Japanese approach to North Korea and the potential threat that they represent?
Well, I think the threat has always been there. So North Korea has had nuclear weapons for at least 10 years, since 2006. So the nuclear shadow has been there over South Korea. It's been there over Japan. And now with the long-range tests, it's growing appreciably in the United States. But I would add that, it's one thing to have the capability. It doesn't mean they're going to use it. And so I think North Korea is not suicidal. They know that if they were to ever attack the United States or its allies, that we would respond with overwhelming force, and that means the destruction of the country. I think really the concern is that sometimes we tend to nitpick North Korea's tests. So we'll say, oh, they didn't achieve this. They didn't demonstrate a reentry vehicle. And so what North Korea may do is that they want to prove beyond any doubt that they have this capability. So the concern is that they would demonstrate a missile test with a live warhead that does an atmospheric detonation over international waters, and that would be a game changer for us. I think another concern for us is that North Korea may now mistakenly believe that they have a nuclear weapon capability, so they can keep the U.S. aside, and they can run amok and coerce South Korea and do a lot of provocations for their purposes.
Well, we started with Japan, and let's go to South Korea now, because we have another contributor that I want to help drive our discussion here. This is Yonsei. This is Yoonjae Kim from the Yonsei University in Seoul, who has a clip here, and I'm going to translate this one as well. Oh, good. I don't have to translate this one. I can give
translate into Korean.
Give my Korean a rest. Yes.
Or Japanese.
Well, I guess the first thing that I would like to know is, why is the U.S. so afraid of North Korea? Like, North Korea has a very tiny army. Even if it gets ICBMs, which it is working its way towards, like, North America still has a qualitative and quantitative military edge, both in conventional and nuclear capabilities. And so the North Koreans know that if they do anything, that if this escalates to an actual conflict with America, I mean, they will just definitively lose. So why is the U.S. making such a big deal of North Korea?
Jean Lee, we've had a lot of analysts and experts and journalists, maybe even you, on The Takeaway, on my show, explaining that South Koreans tend to be much less excited about the North Korean threat than Americans are. Is that true?
It is true to a certain degree. I mean, South Koreans have been living with this threat for decades now, and they have to go about their daily lives. Remember that they are living in a country that is extremely competitive. They have everyday concerns that they're much more concerned about. I remember as a child when I was visiting South Korea, we used to have these regular civil air raid drills. I think they're at 2 p.m. and you have to pull your car over to the side of the road, take cover. Frankly, I think people don't even stop what they're doing right now. They're so oblivious to some of these threats from North Korea. That said, things are a little bit different right now. I think the uncertainty and the lack of clarity in terms of what President Trump might do has unnerved some South Koreans. And also what's interesting is there's a growing call in South Korea among some parts of the population for South Korea to arm itself. I think it's kind of reflected in what the student was saying. Some people are calling for their own, to have nuclear weapons reintroduced to the Korean Peninsula. So this is a really interesting development that I see happening in South Korea.
Frank, you have experience in the diplomatic world, and we're talking about the potential for military confrontations and how these societies view the threat culturally. You've been around the negotiating table. How does the actual threat of violence, the actual threat of war, if there is such a threat, really inform how these discussions? You were at the six-party talks; those are defunct. There may be talks in the future. How does that inform how talks proceed?
Well, this is really the debate over whether we could have a policy of deterrence. I think the student's question is a good one. I think Frank mentioned this as well, that of course, North Korea is not suicidal. I don't think any of us think that. I think that North Korea sees its ICBMs and nuclear weapons programs as a way to prevent the United States from coming to South Korea's aid and probably protecting Japan as well. And so the question here that, one that I think people have been struggling with is can you deter North Korea? Can we, a possible policy solution, can it just be, let's just not give them all this credit and attention for these provocations, and let's just say, you do whatever you want inside, but you can't attack the United States or South Korea, Japan. I would say, of course, we can deter North Korea from those military strikes, but the problem with that as a policy, and that gets to the student's question, is you can't really use that as a policy to deter North Korea from proliferation. For example, North Korea built a nuclear reactor in Syria that was destroyed by Israel in 2007. If our policy is similar to strategic patience and just saying, let's not worry about this, we can of course deter North Korea, let's focus on something else, especially something else with China, right? Then are we prepared to have a North Korea nuclear weapons program and an ICBM program that it will sell to anyone who is willing to pay for that? And that's really the crux of the policy debate with North Korea, which is you can have deterrence as an element of that policy, but what is the other part of that policy? And that's where I think we get into the debate of sanctions versus diplomacy. I just want to make one last point, is that a couple of times panelists up here have noted, it seems like the U.S. and the Japan are not interested in settling. It's interesting that question really needs to be on the other side. Is North Korea really interested in settling? I mean, Ambassador Jo Yoon, who's the special representative for North Korea policy for the U.S., has been trying, I think, to get the North Koreans to respond. And his latest response said there's no signal from North Korea. So if you want to have negotiations, as they say, it takes two to tango, right? And if the North Koreans are not interested in negotiations, where does that leave us? We can't just, show up to Beijing in the Daetai State House where the six-party talks were before and sit at the plenary table and say, okay, we're ready for six-party talks. It doesn't work that way. So the North Koreans have shown no interest in denuclearization talks.
Well, I think they haven't responded. That doesn't mean that they're not interested. I think they eventually do want to get to the negotiating table, but they're doing it on their own timeline. They want to get their nuclear weapons program to a point where they can sit at the table as peers, or that's what they're thinking.
Right. I mean, I guess I would say that's the danger there. Yeah. I mean, I think Madam Che was very clear in Russia that she sees this, or North Korea sees this, as an arms control negotiation, as a discussion amongst nuclear peers, with North Korea replacing the USSR in those negotiations. And that is plainly unacceptable for the United States. I would argue it should be unacceptable for everyone, that we would suggest that we would accept North Korea as a nuclear power as an end goal. That's not naive, suggesting they don't have nuclear weapons now. Of course they have nuclear weapons now. But I think we have to think of, North Korea experts have this, most of us have this flaw of, thinking about it in silos. If we accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons power, the Iranian regime will stand up and say, of course, let's renegotiate that nuclear deal. And you know what I want? I want the North Korea deal. I want the deal where I, in Tehran, can get a nuclear weapon. So we have to be careful about the precedents that we're willing to set here with regard to global nonproliferation.
One moment. In just a few minutes, I want to tell our audience here at the Institute for Peace, we're going to open it up to Q&A from all of you. That's coming up in about 10 or 12 minutes. And I'm telling you now so that you can get the juices flowing, start to think about your questions. You know all of the different areas of expertise that these panelists are bringing to bear, so start to think about your questions, because in a few minutes, the mic is going out into the audience. So I leave you with that. Glyn, go right ahead.
You're saying you shouldn't set a precedent with North Korea, but you've set a precedent with Israel, you've set a precedent with India, you've set a precedent with Pakistan. I mean, the world's most proliferators were the Pakistanis, with A.Q. Khan hawking his gas centrifuges around the world. Where were the sanctions against Pakistan? Where were the threats to Pakistan? Where were the negotiations? No, it was fine. That was fine. North Korea, oh no, they're a big problem. So I mean, from the North Korea perspective, it's the U.S. It's not being, it's changing the rules of the game halfway through.
Frank, you're the one around this table who's worked at the Pentagon, and you don't have a uniform on, but you've worked over there. The other inevitable part of this discussion is military action from the United States and its allies. I had Admiral Mike Mullen on our show a couple of months ago, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I asked him if, when he looks at the big map and looks at the military options inside the Pentagon as they relate to North Korea, if any of those options are good. He said none of them were good. That was his short answer. There was a longer one, but I think that you probably have some thoughts on viable military options, if any really exist. Is there anything the United States can do, failing diplomacy here, to really brush back the North Korean nuclear and missile program?
Well, I'm not going to object to what Admiral Mullen said. That's my first point. There's certainly military options. I wouldn't call them viable military options because they all entail significant loss of life. So there's a recent Congressional Research Service study that came out that said even in a conventional conflict, within the first few days, you would have anywhere from 30,000 to 300,000 deaths. And then obviously those numbers go up exponentially when you have nuclear weapons involved. So that being said, there's other things you can do militarily that may not be escalatory enough that would put us in a conflict. It's hard to think a lot of what those are, because I think if you have a kinetic action that strikes even, say, one missile facility, you know that North Korea will respond, because based on history, when they're pressured, they don't wilt, they certainly persevere, they almost always fight back and retaliate.
Right, I mean, it sounds strange, and it sounded strange to me the first time I read about this, that there is a language of military, you call it kinetic action. I like that phrase they use over at the Pentagon. You have the option of a devastating strike that hits Pyongyang, or you can send 2 cruise missiles to one site, and those two things say different things to the victim, right? Just a pinprick strike says, we're not going to wipe you out, we're just sending a message, so interpret that as message sent. Did that type of language work with the North Koreans?
Firstly, the North Koreans have to interpret what's happening, and there is a danger that they misinterpret what's actually happening. That's the first problem, because they're acutely aware from studying the Iraq War and the rest that they literally have minutes to make a decision. So let's hope that they appreciate the distinction between 2 missiles landing somewhere and a fully fledged assault. So that's the first problem you actually face. And secondly, yeah, there are talks about pinprick strikes. There's talk about if you want shooting down a missile in flight. You might get away with that because Kim Jong-un can actually say that was a missile failure. You strike or disappearing a submarine, fine, or hitting a TEL on the ground. I mean, he's not going to survive very long with his own administration. Yeah, this is not a man on his own. His military agree with what he's doing as well. So, I mean, he's not going to survive if he doesn't fight back.
How about bringing down a computer network with some very creative worms and viruses? I think I've seen that before.
I mean, hang on. I mean, the US is doing that. I mean, why do you think the missiles are failing? I mean, the North Koreans woke up to that and rewired their whole missile systems or whatever, and they started to work. So, I mean, they also read the newspapers about what the Israelis and the Americans were doing in Iran. So, fine. I mean, yeah, that's going on. I think that would work, but it's not a very computer-oriented society. It's not quite like, it's not quite like the States or Europe. They can get by without computers probably better than anybody else can.
Gene, let's get back to kinetics for a second, because the United States has thousands of troops in South Korea, huddled on a couple of bases, as I understand it, within range of North Korean artillery. So we have to think 2 or 3 times about the ramifications of even a pinprick strike.
The United States has 28,000 troops in South Korea, and in the region, 80,000 troops, and we have 200,000 Americans in that part of the world. So there are huge risks to any kind of kinetic action. I don't even know what kinetic action means, but there are huge risks to any kind of action that could spark or trigger military conflict, not just to the Korean people or the Japanese, but to Americans as well. I think when I hear the words military options, we do hear the president threatening in very vague terms that he's going to do something, he's going to handle it. But to me, military options usually means the Americans are going to remind North Korea that they have some powerful tools in the regions, a powerful force in the region, nuclear-operated weaponry that they could unleash if they wanted to. And also remember that they carry out joint military drills, exercises twice a year with South Korea. The North Koreans see this as provocative, and they consider it a rehearsal for an invasion. I think this is something that's really dangerous right now, because we have, just to remind you that there's a Winter Olympics coming up in South Korea in February, so this is something certainly on the mind of the South Koreans. The Americans and the South Koreans have a joint military exercise that's going to overlap with part of the Olympics and the Paralympics. And so this is a huge concern as well, because that's always the start of this cycle of tension on the Korean Peninsula. So but that's also another sort of military option, is these joint military exercises. Not sure I answered your question, but I just
you did after a fashion, because I know the whole idea of kinetics is weird to you, and it is to me a little bit too. Let me go to one more video clip. This one is from Shanghai, from an office worker in Shanghai, China, who asked not to be identified. I'm not sure if I'm translating this one or if it's translated, but I guess we'll find out. This is
wondering if U.S. would ever consult South Korea or solicit help from South Korea or China, and what if they don't help or they don't want to be engaged? What would U.S. proceed?
Jean,
that's interesting.
She wants to know if the U.S. would engage help with South Korea or with China. It's actually a good question. Former Ambassador Chris Hill was on our show just the other day, former ambassador, leader of the Six-Party Talks, where you were, Anthony. He said that one of the motivations he saw on the part of the North right now is to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea, that these increasingly sophisticated missile tests are designed to divide the United States away from its allied relationship with the South. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. One of the major concerns in Seoul right now is something they call Korea passing. It's a little bit of a Konglish phrase, but it's the concern or fear that they're being bypassed. And that the U.S. and North Korea are in the middle of some sort of move toward bilateral discussions that won't involve South Korea. South Korea wants to be part of this discussion. They are really the ones whose lives are at stake here. So they're desperately trying to make sure that they are at that table and at part of those discussions. We've got kind of an ideological difference between the current president of South Korea and the president of the United States. The president of South Korea comes from his parents were born in North Korea, so they were refugees from North Korea. He has a much more of a holistic, I think, sense of the Korean Peninsula. He's concerned about the future of the North Korean people as well. So he doesn't want the obliteration of either South Korea or North Korea. It's a little bit at odds, I think. Of course, right now he is very angry about the provocations, especially with the Olympics coming up. So he is trying to be tough, but he does eventually want engagement. So there's a little bit of a difference in policy and approach between the US and South Korea, but he also wants to be at those discussions. Does not want North Korea to create a situation where the North Koreans are only talking to the United States, or the United States is only talking to North Korea and not including Seoul.
Anthony, do you see the United States vulnerable to a play, if you like, from Pyongyang to divide us away from our allies, from the South Koreans?
Well, you know, I guess that's the part that surprises me the most. I would say that Kim Jong-il was very good at doing that, and very strategic, his father, very strategic in getting incentives for giving up his programs. And of course, we all know that he didn't give up his programs. That's pretty obvious. I was surprised with the election of South Korean President Moon Jae-in that Kim Jong-un didn't make an overture towards South Korea to divide South Korea from the United States. It doesn't seem like that has happened yet. Certainly could be something that he winds up doing. I think that, unfortunately, I think Jean's right, that, of course she's right, that Moon Jae-in would prefer to have a different North Korea policy than he has currently. His North Korea policy, I think in his view, unfortunately is aligned with the tougher policy that the United States wants now, whether it's deploying THAAD or making statements about stronger sanctions. I think he would much prefer talks about reopening Kaesong Industrial Complex, the North-South industrial complex, and we can talk about how that violates sanctions, but that's for another day. I think we'd much prefer, you know, a trip to Pyongyang and a conversation and talking about the Olympics and having, you know, ceremonies associated with that. But he can't do any of that. That's what he ran on, and he cannot do that. That's what surprises me, you know, that Kim Jong-un has not taken that opportunity, having that administration in South Korea, to really drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea. He hasn't done it yet, but maybe he will.
Frank, is Kim aware that the United States does not have an ambassador in Seoul right now? Because he might have an opening here if he wants to sow this kind of dissension that he has an opportunity to sow. We don't have a top person there.
Right. We don't have an ambassador to South Korea. I do think that point is maybe a little bit exaggerated, because we have definitely a strong cohort of career officials at the State Department that do their jobs very well. But it reflects concern amongst people in South Korea and in the region about the lack of attention given to diplomacy.
I don't think you're short of people giving sensible advice in South Korea. You've got General Vincent Brooks, who I think is an exceptionally good man. So I wouldn't worry too much about whether Victor Chao's going to arrive in Seoul any day soon. I mean, that's not the problem. I mean, I think what's interesting, of course, is clearly Kim Jong-un is not trying to divide, if you want, South Korea from the United States, because he's not made the kind of offers that you'd expect him to make. So clearly that's not one of his aims.
What would you expect him to do if that were one of his aims? What would be his best play now if he were trying to drive that wedge, which a lot of people expect?
I mean, I don't think he's terribly interested at the moment. I mean, he was probably interested back in July when he thought that there could be a difference, but then Moon Jae-in made the decision that he couldn't afford to be further than lips and teeth away from Trump, because the danger was that South Korea was going to be left out of the decision-making loop, and that was going to be bad news for South Korea. And I fully agree that, I mean, the South Koreans don't trust President Trump. So in the short term, they're going to cleave to him as closely as possible. In the medium term, they're seriously talking not about US nuclear weapons, but they're developing their own nuclear deterrent, because they don't trust the United States, and maybe rightly, to actually trade Washington for Seoul. So on that basis, they're going to be looking after their own interests. So the one thing we might see out of this, because if South Korea goes nuclear, Japan will follow within 15 minutes.
Very quickly.
And we're going to get a whole new environment there. But I think that's what the situation is. The North Koreans realize that to resolve their dilemma, they have to talk to the United States. Nobody else really matters in the end. So that's the solution. there's a bit of peripheral work with the South, with the people who are going to be paying the bills, because Donald Trump was not going to ask Congress to pay any bills for North Korea, and even if he did, he wouldn't get it. So it's going to be the South Koreans doing the heavy lifting with maybe some assistance from China, European Union, and possibly, it depends how long it takes, Japan.
All right. Just 1 or 2 minutes left before we go to our final break and then on to questions from our distinguished audience here. We've talked a lot about sticks. We've talked a lot about sanctions. We've talked a lot about ratcheting down. Let's give a moment of lip service to carrots, shall we? Anthony, you're the sanctions man. Talk about carrots for a moment. It may only take you a minute. What positive motivation do we have to offer the North right now, and should we?
Well, sure. I mean, I'm probably the rare person that talks about sanctions that thinks we should be talking to North Korea directly. Now, I distinguish between talks and negotiations. I think that it's valuable to talk to North Korea directly. I'm going to avoid listing out carrots, because I would say my criticism of our negotiation strategy is that we would negotiate for both sides. In other words, we determine what we want from North Korea, denuclearization, and how we get to that point, and then we determine, what we're going to tell North Korea we're willing to give them in order to achieve that goal. It's North Korea that should tell us what they need from us in a negotiated settlement. We shouldn't be coming to the table with a list of, here are the number of sanctions we can release, here's the amount of heavy fuel oil we could give you. These are just past incentives that we've given them. And I would just say, my final point will be, that is the one area that we're not talking a lot about. What would be the negotiation strategy in a renewed six-party talks? Because remember, 2005 six-party talks joint statement says no nuclear program, no nuclear weapons for North Korea. That's certainly not what the Iran deal negotiated, right? So we'd have to discuss that. And then we have to think about how do we flip it on its head and get North Korea to commit to denuclearization up front. The flaw in the negotiations in the 2000s and in the 1990s was that we accepted this long drawn-out negotiations that in the end did not lead us to denuclearization.
Anthony, I think there might be a book in your future on the fine art of making deals. I think there's a market for that.
I think that one might be written, but I'll look at it.
Has it? I wasn't sure. Jean, carrot.
So I just want to follow up on something you mentioned, which was, I agree that if we're going to figure out what it is they want, we also have to understand who they are and what they want and how to reach them. And unfortunately, at this point in time, we're at a point where we have almost no access and there's almost no interaction. Part of that is what we call the New York Channel has been silent to a certain degree. That's the North Korean mission to the UN. Also, we have a travel ban in place on Americans right now for starting in September. It'll be good for at least a year. That prohibits most Americans from traveling to North Korea. So there's so little opportunity for us to really get to know who they are. That's certainly a concern of mine. If we don't know who they are, how do we even know how to punish them or reach out to them? But in terms of a carrot, I'm just going to quickly say, one of the interesting things when Donald Trump was campaigning was that he said, I would sit down with Kim Jong-un and have a hamburger with him. And I have to say it was kind of intriguing. There are reasons why you don't do that, because it really legitimizes the person you're sitting down with, and that's certainly a concern. But I can tell you that that's exactly what Kim Jong-un wants. So it was an intriguing proposal to put out there, and I'm very interested to know if that could ever happen.
A little bit of burger diplomacy, which means legitimacy. Frank, is that a good carrot?
That is a good carrot, and I think, so we know exactly what North Korea wants because they've stated it repeatedly. And I believe at this point the price has probably gone up. So we know that they want to keep their nuclear weapons. They want relief from sanctions. They want an end to U.S. hostile policy, which means end to military exercises, removal of U.S. forces from the Korean Peninsula. They want economic concessions. So we know what they want. It's just a matter of what are we willing to concede that allows them to get to the table or eventually get the goals that we want.
And a peace treaty, which is part of all of it.
That's a lot. That's a bushel of carrots. I asked for one carrot. You gave me a bushel of carrots. Glyn, one carrot.
Peace treaty.
That's a big carrot. That's a Bugs Bunny sized carrot.
Yeah. Well, you wanted one. You're going to get one. It's a big one.
Yeah.
And a peace treaty, just as simple as that, come to the table
yeah,
to
but it's
negotiate
impossible. Congress, you'd be lucky to get one vote in Congress for a peace treaty with North Korea.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is part of the problem. I mean, some of the things they want are impossible to deliver. So let's be realistic. And you have to see it the other way around. Some things the US wants and we want. The European Union would really like North Korea to give a nuclear weapon. We can't get, because you can't deliver some of the things they want. So let's be realistic about, we're going to meet in the middle somewhere. Now, it seems to me that the US interest is really about stopping them definitively having the ability to hit the mainland USA. Forget about the nuclear weapons, that's gone. That ship sailed. That ship sailed in 2010, I think, which was the last time they mentioned the possibility of getting rid of their nuclear weapons.
Well, another book in your future, Glyn, Impossible Carrots. I already have a title for you. We're going to take another short break of just about a minute or two, and that will give all of you a chance to get your questions ready. The mic will start traveling around the room because you have an opportunity to question these experts yourselves, so stay with us. To 30 or less, and we can go home.
This is the last?
Yes, last bit coming up.
And is it all
also make sure to, when you ask a question, just identify yourself, and then if you have a panelist you want to address to, you identify who you want to address the question.
All right, we'll take another second. Your radio show that's going to be all cut together on your local NPR station. It'll probably be on WAMU, so now's your chance. But like we always say on the show that I work on, this show relies on you, and this part of the show definitely relies on you. So do not be shy. You're here because you care about these issues, so this is your chance to get in. And I really want you to do it. Definitely want to hear from you. So please get in there, and we're going to start in just 1 second. Okay. There you go. Welcome back, everyone, to our program, Brinksmanship, U.S.-North Korea Relations here at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. We're pleased to welcome back our panel, USIP's Frank Aum, Jean Lee from the Wilson Center, Anthony Ruggiero on the end, and Glyn Ford on the other end. Thank you all for being here. One last little round of applause, if you would. Well, now it's time for you to have your say in your questions. I've asked plenty, and I'm looking forward to a little bit of a break. All I have to do now for the next couple of minutes is point to the audience, and hands are already up, so there's going to be a mic coming around the room. Identify yourself and who you'd like your question to go for. Let's start with the woman with her hand up right up there.
Hello, my name is Bailey O'Donnell. I am a freshman over at American University studying international affairs with a thematic area in national security, human rights, and conflict resolution. I'd like to address Mr. and Ruggiero. I'm going to get
Ruggiero. I called him Frank before, and his name is Anthony, so don't feel bad.
Well, there we go. Is making a deal with North Korea possible, or do you think it would be arguing with a child that wants a cookie, but you can't give them the cookie, but they really want the cookie? And if military intervention is preventable or necessary?
I think a deal is possible, but at the moment, it's looking very unlikely because I feel what the U.S. wants and what North Korea wants is so fundamentally irreconcilable. And so I think, the U.S. is saying, or North Korea is saying that we absolutely want to keep our nuclear weapons, and the U.S. is saying North Korea absolutely cannot keep its nuclear weapons. So if you take this all or nothing maximalist approach, then there really isn't space for diplomacy. I think there needs to be a little give, or there needs to be a focus or a shift away from that singular focus on denuclearization and a look at more practical, achievable, intermediate steps that give us the political space to later on tackle some of the harder issues.
Well, I mean, I'll start there. I mean, I would just remind people that we've tried the middle ground, right? We've tried it a couple of times. When we tried it in the 1990s, North Korea built a covert uranium enrichment program, which was another path to a nuclear weapon. And then we tried it again in the six-party talks. And North Korea was building a nuclear reactor in Syria. And even after that was destroyed by Israel, the United States continued its negotiations, removing North Korea from the state sponsor of terrorism list, blowing up the cooling tower at Yongbyon, and none of that worked. So I think we have to be very clear-eyed suggesting that there's this middle ground here. That sounds like the pessimist, but I'm actually the optimist. I do believe that there is a negotiated settlement where North Korea denuclearizes. And how do you achieve that is the type of sanctions that I was describing earlier. I know that everybody is a pessimist when it comes to sanctions, but there will come a time when Chinese banks are punished for what they did for North Korea. And then you will have Chinese banks on the front lines identifying North Korean money that is sitting in China that is used for the elites, for the military, and for the weapons programs. And what Kim Jong-un is going to have to decide is which of those are most important. Now he gets to rank those 1A, B, and C. What happens when he has to rank those 1, 2, and 3? And that's going to be the issue for him. His revenue is going to dry up. His relationship, his economic relationship with China is going to dry up. And that is the leverage that the United States can use to bring a negotiated settlement. We don't have that leverage now. And I think we shouldn't get caught up in the provocations that distract us. It's a deliberate attempt by North Korea to distract the United States from denuclearization.
Anthony, how hard are you working to raise this strategy up to the Trump administration and to convince them that Iran-style sanctions are the way to go?
Well, I think they already know that. I think that we certainly have conversations with them. I think there's some great work being done by organizations here in the U.S. and D.C. in particular. C480S, for one, has written 2 groundbreaking reports on Chinese networks. And the point I would make there is if C480S can find it here in D.C., some of the largest banks in the world in China can find it. I would also say Capitol Hill is watching. Some of the sanctions that were passed last year and this year, and Executive Order 13810 that was issued by this administration in September, are carbon, in some cases, carbon copies from the sanctions program in Iran. The issue here is the United States administration willing to go and implement those sanctions? And in this case, means going after China. And are other countries willing to move past from North Korea? We're seeing some positive, right? Over 20 countries have reduced commercial or diplomatic relationships. We need to see more. But that has only been in this really over the last year.
It's interesting. That's the place to watch over the next year or two, I think. Let's go. I don't want to give you too far to walk. Can we go down to the front to this gentleman here?
Hello, fascinating discussion. I'm Michael Marshall from the Global Peace Foundation. I'd like to hear from Ms. Lee and Mr. Ford, who've spent extensive time in North Korea, on their take on changes within North Korean society, particularly as it affects the elites. The people in Pyongyang, how important are they? And what's going to happen if their standard of living, instead of steadily climbing, starts to decline? And then also the nexus between marketization and elite corruption. Thank you.
Jean, you go first.
The elites in Pyongyang, or the population of Pyongyang, is extremely important to the regime or to the leadership. It's, some people describe North Korea as having a court economy. I like to think of it a little bit like a monarchy, in a sense. You have to keep a certain number of people happy in order to win their loyalty. So that's extremely important. And remember that until fairly recently, so many of the elites of Pyongyang were working or traveling overseas. The flights that I used to take were packed with North Koreans who were doing business overseas, studying, or had other reasons to go overseas. We're seeing some of that stop now, of course, because of some of these sanctions. But that meant that they were exposed to what life was like outside their country. So they were developing a taste for some of these creature comforts, iPhones. I used to sit next to, just like me, the North Koreans would have to, until 2013, they would have to lock their iPhones up or their Samsung phones up in lockers at the airport. Now they can take them in once they register them, but often saw them with these devices that they became very comfortable with. So in some sense, what we've seen since Kim Jong-un took power is a lot of effort to try to make sure to keep that population happy. So I've been traveling there for almost 10 years, and I can tell you that it's changed. This is a country where change comes at a glacial pace, but in terms of the consumer culture, it's changed quite a bit, and that is directly because he knows he needs to keep those people happy. He needs to give them some of those creature comforts. Now, whether or not sanctions affect their access to this kind of these kinds of creature comforts, I do think that we're starting to see some of those fissures. We've had quite a number of high-profile defections from that elite class in the last year, so perhaps we're starting to see that there's a strain on even that population in Pyongyang.
Glyn?
Yeah, I mean, the people of Pyongyang are extremely important, and it's been very clear since around 2008 that there's been that Pyongyang was always privileged, but there's been an enormous further privileging of Pyongyang. I mean, you've now got restaurants, shops, you've got a dolphinarium, outdoor water parks, outdoor ice skating rinks in summer, horse riding stables when you can't have a ski slope in Pyongyang, but you've got one in Wonsan. You've got package holidays down to Mount Kumgang. There's that enormous privileging. And you have borders around Pyongyang. Anybody can leave, but coming back in, you need permission. So, this is a closed city, and it's very important for Kim Jong-un to actually deliver to those people, which is the point I'm making. He believes he has to do two things, which is the Bunjin line. He needs nuclear weapons to stop regime change, a la Libya, Syria, Iraq, and he needs to grow the economy. Now, there's a degree of incompatibility there, and that's the trick he's actually got to pull off. Now, I mean, maybe the sanctions will work. I suspect that at a certain point, China's going to get fed up. The notion that you can push China around as if it's some third world country, I suspect doesn't work anymore. President Xi will put up with quite a lot, but there will be a point in which he says enough is enough, and you start interfering with China's banks in a big way, and enough will be enough.
Elite corruption?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know, but I'm pretty convinced that there is a level of corruption in North Korea. It's probably not entirely dysfunctional. If you look at levels of corruption around the world, Nigeria barely functions because of corruption. I mean, there are other places where they're functional. I don't think it's interfering with the functioning of the system. It's, to a degree, it's a bit like Japan. In a way, you have networks, and they have the same kind of networks. Most of the industries, most of the import-exports are connected to a ministry, to a military unit, to a section of the party. They're the protected ones, and outside of that, you've got what I call the kiosk capitalists, the ronin, the masterless people going out, creating the marketplace. Some make a lot of money. Most end up in the hands of the loan sharks and lose their homes and their possessions. But that's capitalism. I mean, what they want at the moment is they want two countries, one system. That's what the North Koreans want. They want a separate North and separate South, 25 years to grow their economy, and then they'll be in a position to unify.
Let's see some more hands if we can. Ma'am, there in the black sweater.
Hi, my name is Maria Jessup. I'm with Karuna Center for Peace Building. Thank you for this discussion. My question is about talks and what is the right way to go about encouraging those talks, and who are the right players to let's say, mediate those talks? It seems the situation is too polarized between the U.S. and North Korea for there to be really direct talks without some sort of facilitation. So my question is, first of all, when you talk about the elite, are there people within that group that can be harnessed to come up with some sort of platform for talks? Are there intelligentsia that can be drawn, or is it only people from the political parties that can be engaged? If you could just talk about the potential for talks and how that might come about, that'd be great.
Jean, would you like to take that one?
Well,
it's not Dennis Rodman, I know that.
Does one of you want to take on the background on, are you talking about direct talks or even say track 2 talks?
Well, I'll make a quick point, but I'm sure Glyn has something to say. So I want to reinforce a point that Anthony made, but also provide some background. So in early 2015, North Korea actually originated their proposal for a dual freeze, which now China has sort of taken up the mantle on. And then later in the fall of 2015, they also proposed peace party talks. So they have been proposing talks certainly in recent years. But I think Anthony is right that recently, at least since September or so, they've been silent. And so if we don't have that partner on the other end, it's hard to see that happen. So things may change, things are fluid, but I think you need to have a willing partner.
I suspect you're going to get a willing partner. I mean, as I say, I think the announcement, the best news of the third ICBM was the announcement by Kim Jong-un that he's now finished his program. Now, the logic of that, he's now, in the near future, they will now be willing to talk. He didn't have to say that. I suspect if the US doesn't get down to talking, or if the talks fail, he'll carry on with the program. I mean, you look at the history of the United States development of nuclear weapons, you have a series of tests, you develop a particular weapon, then a bit later you start another series of tests because you're developing something different. So, you know, there are places for him to go, but at the moment there's a pause on.
Who's next? Let's go to this gentleman down in the third row, please. Also with the black sweater, that's our theme.
Thanks. Aaron Munn from the University of Melbourne. So 2 questions. One is, I've heard there's plans to close the sanctions office within the Department of State, and I wonder if Iranian-style sanctions are the way forward, whether that closure will affect the capacity of the US to implement that regime. And the second is that the 2013 International Crisis Group report on North Korea suggested a positive way forward was really to avoid state tracks and to focus on sporting exchanges, the private sector, so around adventure travel, to open up new links on a people-to-people basis. So I wonder if anyone's got some good examples of where they've been able to continue despite the travel ban situation.
Anthony, go ahead.
Sorry, I wasn't able to hear the first questions on sanctions.
On sanctions. Would you mind if you restated your question just a little louder and use a radio trick? Get right up close to that mic, yeah.
Yeah, my apologies.
That's the one.
So I've heard there's plans to close the sanctions office within the State Department. And so I wonder if that's going to reduce the capacity of the US to implement an Iranian-style regime.
Sure. You know, I would say that the decision to close the sanctions office in the State Department, I think that a lot of those responsibilities are going to be moved to other elements of the State Department, and I'm sure there will be others, whether it's in the policy planning branch or in the East Asia office, that will be able to get other countries to implement North Korea sanctions. I think what we saw also in the Iran sanctions was that the Treasury Department actually played a larger diplomatic role, where you had the Undersecretary for the Treasury Department going overseas, meeting with banks and companies and countries directly and describing the sanctions. So I'm not, you know, I wouldn't focus as much on bureaucracies. I would focus more on, are the right sanctions in place? Is the Trump administration actually implementing those sanctions? And are they pushing countries to be consistent in their interactions with North Korea?
It's music to Rex Tillerson's ears, who tells us that there is no hollowing out. going on at the State Department.
I won't comment on that, but I think that traditionally secretaries of state have different priorities, and it was only a couple of years ago that the sanctions office did not exist, and we were fine with sanctions.
Good enough. Let's get.
He had a second.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you did.
2013.
Did you want that question for Glyn Ford? Did you catch it? His question. Restate it one more time, and we're going to do the loud mic.
Yeah, I apologise. I'm stealing mic time here. So the second question was about the 2013 International Crisis Group report, which called for positive moves forward in terms of sporting exchanges, private sector initiatives, so adventure travel programs, and not just from the US, but from around the world. So I wonder if the panel has some positive examples of where that's continued, despite the travel ban situation.
I think sports is probably, you mentioned sports. Sports diplomacy still has some potential. It's one of the only arenas. It's one of the only ways that North Koreans can get overseas right now. We have an opportunity with the upcoming Olympics. We don't know if the North Koreans are going to send a delegation. They have pair skaters who've qualified. But sports is always one area. The North Koreans know this as well, and they try to take advantage of that, so there's some potential there. But a lot of other avenues for people-to-people engagement have been cut off.
No other areas for the soft power of vacation planning to the Grand Canyon or the suburbs of Pyongyang? No?
I mean, logically, the more you engage the North Koreans, the better. If you want to change the regime, I mean, have engagement. Disengagement is entirely the wrong approach. I mean, I picked Lithuania. I'm sure there'll be a Lithuanian here. But if Lithuania cuts off diplomatic relations, it doesn't matter a damn, because they don't have diplomatic relations in any meaningful sense of the term. The United Kingdom has an embassy in Pyongyang. I think it would be completely crazy for us to close the embassy in Pyongyang and to throw out the North Koreans from Britain. We want to get a dialogue. How the hell do you talk to them if you've thrown them out? So, the more engagement, the better. Every time they set off an ICBM, I'd engage more.
But
keep it quick. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I just want to point out the differences in evaluations. After 10 months, people want to declare sanctions don't work. But after decades of engagement with North Korea that have not produced the type of regime that we want, the answer is more engagement. So I think we got to be consistent in how we evaluate our approach to North Korea.
We've had 64 years of sanctions.
No, we actually haven't.
We've had 64 years of sanctions.
Maybe we could have that conversation in the committee.
Every time we have new, tougher sanctions, nobody says this lot aren't going to work because we're just playing. Every set of sanctions is going to be the one that works.
Happy to send you my work. We can have that conversation.
I'm going to declare sanctions on this part of the debate just so that we can make sure that the audience has more questions. This gentleman on the end.
Hi, Garrett Redfield. I work at the Institute for Defense Analyses. My question's for Frank. Given that you're recently removed from government and no longer under the bureaucratic thumb, so to speak, so you're able to speak your mind and be a little bit candid, I'm hoping that you could provide insight into how much care and consideration was given to past policy towards North Korea under Clinton and Bush. And I ask that because an individual who you may know, who I've had at-length discussions with, Evans Revere, was pegged to be, at the time, the first U.S. ambassador to North Korea. And he mentioned at the time, state did have that on the table, all the things that North Korea wanted, the peace treaty, the lifting of sanctions, and it didn't work. So that's why I'm curious to know how much under the Obama administration there was that care and consideration to what the U.S. had done in the past.
That's a great question.
Yeah, I could probably talk for a while on that. First of all, I'd say that the U.S. Institute of Peace is funded by Congress. We're technically an independent organization, but we're also mindful. So I wouldn't say that I feel completely free in saying things.
Oh, you're slithering out of this one.
That being said, so you're right. I think there were some discussions, I think in the late 90s, about developing a special interest section in Pyongyang, and people in the State Department were studying Korean to eventually go and serve in that special interest section. I will say that the Obama administration gave careful consideration to its policies, and obviously I was a member of the administration, so I may sound biased, but I would argue that certainly it tried diplomacy early on in the first term, and we saw that leading to two deals. One is the Leap Day deal in February 2012, which was a moratorium on nuclear missile tests in exchange for 240,000 tons of food aid. There was also a deal that people don't know much about, which is on remains recovery. So there was a deal for U.S. soldiers to go into North Korea and help recover the remains of over 5,000 sets of U.S. servicemen from the Korean War. And that fell by the wayside when North Korea conducted a satellite launch in April 2012. I think in the second half of the Obama administration, that was basically, that's the same policy that Trump is using right now. So the Trump administration's policy is an extension of what Obama did, which is maximize pressure and build this coalition of the international community to put pressure and isolate North Korea. I think Anthony would agree that the Trump administration has probably done, they've really emphasized the maximize part, and so he may see some differences, but I think the strategy is basically the same. I think the Trump administration, to its credit, has done a great job in pressuring not just North Korea, but China, and I'm sure Anthony can list all the things that China is doing over the last year that suggests that the pressure is working.
Satisfied? It's a good question. There's a man in the back with his hand held high.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kevin Grave. I'm based at the Wilson Center, and I have a question again on sanctions. Sorry. So I guess this is directed at Anthony, but I think there's an assumption in what you say and in what many people say about sanctions, in that the more strong they are, the more successful they're likely to be. But I'm not sure that's necessarily the case historically if you look when sanctions have been applied. I mean, I think the strongest sanctions were not against Iran, but against Iraq in the 1990s, which went on for years, and led to, by some accounts, to the death of 500,000, premature death of 500,000 children. So there's a huge human cost. But I think the reason for that is that sanctions work through very specific, it's not just about how strong they are, but it's about the political and the socio-economic mechanisms through which they actually induce change. And if you look at North Korea, it's actually, I think it's one of the countries that's least susceptible to sanctions because of the nature of its politics and its economy as well, which is actually very self-efficient. So, North Korea, it's not only authoritarian, but it's almost totalitarian. It doesn't have splits between elites like Iran did. It doesn't have a civil society like South Africa did. So, all these things make me very skeptical about the capability of sanctions to induce policy change in North Korea.
Why don't we keep it there, because that's actually a really fine place to stop and get an answer from Anthony.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've heard a lot of these arguments. I think that I think we have to look at what is North Korea spending its money on, and that's what I mentioned earlier. And I think that the comparison I made with Iran is more that Iran was targeted financial sanctions. I think the Iraq example was more during the time when we had more of a broad-based, country-based sanctions program, which, I think if you look at the end of the Iran program, we were probably closest to that, but the ramp up was what's considered targeted financial sanctions. I think we're somewhere in the middle, maybe toward the end of that process with North Korea in the sense of what's already been implemented. But yeah, I agree. I think the issue here is that this is not a regime that cares a lot about its people. And so I've heard this many times as a criticism of sanctions, that the North Korean people will just continue to suffer, and that's sanctions' fault, when it really is the North Korea regime's fault. The issue here is, how do you restrict the revenue that is going to the three levers that they're using for regime survival, and that they don't have to make that determination now, the elites, the military, and the weapons programs. The one thing that the North Koreans have helped out in this regard is keeping some of that money, or in some cases maybe all of that money, in China. That's a significant vulnerability for them. And so the issue here for North Korea is going to be, if China starts to restrict that voluntarily or involuntarily, how will they react? And then the questions you raise of how will that react amongst the elites and then within the civil society? Those are certainly open questions. I think the way it worked with Iran is that eventually we got to a point where there were severe pressures on their economy. And in the case of Iran, one of their commodities in the sale of oil that was restricted overseas, and that they got to a point where that leverage, they had to release that pressure, or these drivers, these civil society and elite pressures could have been overwhelming on the regime.
I think there's one other, I'm just going to add on to that, there's one other way to look at sanctions, and that's to look at it as a possible tool for diplomacy, in the sense that if North Korea is continuing to build up its program, you also want to have, if you're on the other side of the eventual negotiating table, you want to have something that you can negotiate away. So that's just another way to look at it.
Yeah, leverage. I mean, that's the thing. If we walked into negotiations today, we don't have a lot of leverage, that's and when I talked about deterrence, not preventing proliferation, if we're not getting to denuclearization, sanctions is a way to prevent that proliferation as well.
But we accept that if sanctions are working, they're going to be hurting ordinary North Korean men, women, and children, and not the elite.
All right, I'm going to exercise my leverage here and tell you that we just have about 4 or 5 minutes before we're going to wrap up. So the place where I want to wrap up before you leave us today is with what I think is the bottom line of this discussion. We're going to go to each of you just before we wrap up. Frank, you're going to go last since you're our host. You're going to get the last word on this. I'll give you the last word slot. How urgent is this problem? This problem we've spent the last 90 minutes talking about. Are we actually closer to war than we were a year ago? Glyn, go ahead.
Absolutely. I mean, quite how close we are, I don't know, but I mean, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists used to have the famous clock advancing towards midnight, which is when the next nuclear war was going to happen. And it used to be about 3 minutes to midnight. I say we're 1 minute to midnight. Now, there's a real prospect. And if you talk to people in Washington about what the possibilities are, they talk 10, 20, 30%. Now, those are incredibly high numbers, because if you asked someone 10 years ago, we were down around 0. So we're in a worrying position, and it seems to me that the only way you get out of that, there are three roads to war at various speeds. One is to take military action. One is covert action, which is we haven't talked about, the U.S. policy of change regime. The third one is sanctions, because if they really start hurting, do we think Kim Jong-un is going to come to the negotiating table or engage in military adventurism? And the fourth one, the only peaceful solution, is through negotiations. And the sooner we get there, the better.
Jean Lee, saber-rattling, tweeting, and increasingly sophisticated tests, are we actually closer to confrontation than we were?
We're close. There's so much potential to be drawn into some sort of conflict. We've got, as I mentioned, 80,000 U.S. troops in the region. How many more do we have from North Korea, South Korea, poised and ready, braced? I mean, with this last missile test, it was just not that long after that the South Korean army conducted its own missile test, so clearly they were prepared. But I'm just going to say something else, which is I am not so concerned about the prospect of nuclear war, but I am, as somebody who lives on the Korean Peninsula, concerned about every test and the dangers posed not only in terms of safety. I mean, there was an entire mountain in North Korea that collapsed after the last underground nuclear test. Think about all the radiation that was transmitted into the air. If we have another nuclear test, it's possible it might be above ground, as Frank mentioned, hugely dangerous. And then also, I want to just mention the cost to the North Korean people. This is an expensive program, and they are diverting resources away from basic infrastructure. Just want to tell you, so normally in the past, this was the time of year when I was in North Korea, freezing. They don't have heat, they don't have electricity, they have limited electricity, clean water, running water, toilet. I mean, it's a difficult place to live, and by allowing this program to continue, we're taking food out of the mouths of average North Koreans. So I do worry about, I just want to remind you that the people of the Korean Peninsula are also paying the price.
Anthony Ruggiero, your final thoughts if we're actually closer to war than we were.
Well, I don't think we're closer to a military conflict or war. I am concerned that North Korea will engage in a military action like they did 7 years ago to sink a South Korean naval vessel and kill over 40 South Korean sailors. I'm concerned that the North Koreans will interpret really our inaction in 2010 as an ability to do something like that. I think that's really the danger I see, that something happens and that it escalates quickly. I would also say that we have to be careful about creating these mindsets that we can just have some talks with North Korea and that we will magically be able to wave a magic wand and solve this issue. I think we need to be very careful about the drive by Beijing in particular to drive up the danger and say that we're going to have a military conflict and the only solution is a flawed nuclear deal, a freeze for freeze. I think that makes us more dangerous. I think the over 70-day pause clarifies that North Korea continues these programs even when we think that they are already stopped. So the only solution, the only peaceful solution right now, continue with sanctions to create the leverage for denuclearization talks.
Frank, last word.
So I think at the current trajectory, the situation is very urgent. Either President Trump is serious about what he's saying. So when he says fire and fury, when he says the calm before the storm, when he says the window is closing, he either means it, in which case the situation is urgent, or he's bluffing, in which case we kind of go to a status quo where we continue to contain North Korea, we continue to deter North Korea, but at the same time we open ourselves up to a situation that Anthony mentioned, which is where we sort of stumble into a conflict because of a conventional provocation. I think, I don't want to leave it on a pessimistic note. I think, again, the situation is fluid, things can change. I believe in sanctions. I believe in the saying that sanctions don't work until they work. I think they're necessary, but also they're not sufficient. I think the same applies for diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't work until it works. And I think there's a good track record in the 90s of diplomacy working, the agreed framework working for 8 years. It prevented the plutonium processing at Yongdun for 8 years until the agreed framework was scrapped. So I think there's always a potential, but the situation has to change from both the North Korean side and the United States side.
I want to thank all of you for joining us for this program today. It's been a pleasure for me. I want to thank Frank our host here at the USIP. Thanks so much. Glyn, thanks to you. Jean and Anthony, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me as part of this. It's been a lot of fun. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Sit here.
Oh, I have to do the radio magic. Okay.
Just say, Frank, Jean, just like pretend like you're asking them just for editing purposes. Like,
oh, give them little throws with them.
Little throws with each other.
Mm-hmm. If you want to watch Radio Magic, you're welcome to watch it. It doesn't look like much. I promise you that. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Glyn, Frank, Jean, Anthony.